Have you ever wanted to love a video game, but you were let down? That's what I want to talk about today. I've picked out 5 games that I just wanted to love, that I was excited for, that I felt like I was going to play for many weeks, months, perhaps even years. And I'm going to start off with the original Titanfall. I am not a big first person shooter fan, but occasionally an FPS game kind of grabs me. And when I saw the gameplay of Titanfall, I figured, well, it looks interesting. It might just be E3 hype. And then I picked it up. I had just built a new computer, and this came out obviously for the PC along with the Xbox One, and I think some of the Xbox 360 also had a release. So I picked it up, and I was pretty surprised with what Titanfall had to offer. It was at its core a traditional FPS game as far as its mechanics, but it mixed up its mechanics in really interesting ways and took advantage of emerging graphical capabilities. So, it ran at a smooth frame rate. The Titan drops were these kind of dramatic cinematic moments, and the parkour elements, when you were a pilot, kind of scaling various buildings and taking people out at different angles. The maps kind of facilitated different strategies as you went through the game. I really enjoyed all of that. I thought it was a perfectly balanced blend of styles because on the one hand, you felt like this incredible badass when you got the Titanfall and when you were in those mechas. But then, you were vulnerable to those attacks from above. You had to try to do as much damage as quickly as possible unless one of the pilots, on foot kind of, jumped on top, mounted you, and ripped out your circuitry. So there was this really fun, palpable sense of tension throughout the game. And I think one of the kind of signals of this game's quality was the fact that, I wasn't very good at it, and yet I really enjoyed the online matchups. And I felt a sense of accomplishment, if I could take down a Titan, or if I could, take out a number of other players, that had this kind of thing where you had bots, but then you also had human opponents. And if I took down those human opponents and, earned the burn cards for that, I felt really one of the better senses of accomplishment that I felt, at least in modern gaming. But the downfall of Titanfall was that it was only an online multiplayer game, and the online community really dried up pretty quickly, leaving this game as just a shell. There was, after a few months, really nothing to do in Titanfall. And a lot of people said the game needed a first-person mode, and I think with Titanfall 2, we've seen what the game can be with a first-person mode, Titanfall 2 being, I think, one of the best shooters of all time. But for the original Titanfall, I always thought, well, you didn't really need a first-person mode, but boy, would it have been nice if they gave you kind of like a skirmish mode where you can add a certain number of bots and pilots and Titans. And you could almost make it like some of the old Unreal Tournament games where, yeah, they were fun online, but you could kind of plan out your battles and have these epic battles just with PC or NPC opponents. And I felt like, boy, if Titanfall had that, I'd be playing it until this day. Maybe not religiously now that the initial sort of sexiness of the game has worn down, but certainly, I think it came out in 2014, 2015. So, certainly for 3-4 years, I could have seen myself really enjoying that original Titanfall game. And when I go back to it, as much as I appreciated what it was trying to do, I feel tremendously let down when I think about what it could have been. So next up is Backbreaker, and I'm going to file this under the rubric of being let down. When Madden released for the PS3 and Xbox 360, you could see the direction it was going, and I knew that the heyday of Madden was over, and this was going to be a lazy, sloppily developed kind of game. And hey, that's what Madden has been now for over a decade. So as soon as I played Madden 06, 7, 8 on the PS3, I was wishing for something else. And obviously, 2K had stopped making football games with All Pro 2008. So along came Backbreaker, and the promise of Backbreaker was it was a true physics-based football game that would kind of allow you to play the sport in a way you haven't played it before by actually, taking on different positions. You could certainly do wide receiver, quarterback, running back, and defensive lineman, linebacker. Maybe you could have been a defensive back. But the idea was, you would put yourself in the position to make plays and then use this physics engine to deliver brutal hits. And the selling point was that no two games would be the same. You would always see different animations. On top of that, they released a big DLC maybe a year after it came out that had all these customization tools. So people actually were able to bring the NFL into the game. So right there, this just had so much potential. But what happened? Well, the core of the game was just not fun to play. No matter what you did, you really didn't have a Madden or a 2K football game. You had what was essentially a physics engine tech demo placed into the sport of football. So certain things worked really well. Like I loved playing defense. I loved coming off the edge as a defensive lineman and trying to, put that devastating hit on the quarterback. I loved playing as the linebacker and kind of reading the gaps and putting a devastating hit on the running back. But when you pull back from those moments and you try to play it as you would play a Madden game or a 2K game, it just wasn't fun as a football game. And that was a shame. As much as they try to force it into the shape of a traditional football game, it wasn't that. It was, again, a tech demo. And some of the stuff was fun. Like they had this mini game where you were running and juking and avoiding tacklers. It was a unique, I think, creative, original idea. And I would have liked to have seen the series move forward and see if they couldn't clean up its overall appeal. But in the end, it just kind of remained a niche product, and I ultimately came away saying, well, Madden's no longer fun, and this game is interesting, but it's also not fun, and thus ended my time playing football games until very recently when I discovered, people modding older games like Madden 2008. So Backbreaker, again, creative, enjoyable to a degree, just like Titanfall, but ultimately incredibly flawed. So now we're going to go from games that kind of let you down to games that, at least in my case, pissed me off. And the first one here is WRC 7. And I would say I was more pissed off at myself for falling for this game. If you're not familiar with the WRC series, it was developed by a company called Milestone SRL. And Milestone has, I believe it's an Italian company, and they've kind of collected all of the licenses for all of the great racing series, I think, outside of Formula One. So all the Superbikes and MotoGP and WRC licenses that really could make for some interesting games, especially on modern consoles. And they just butcher them. They're horrible playing games. They're technically flawed. They allure you with some the screenshots and some of the graphics, but then when they're actually running, they're a disappointment. So WRC, I noticed, wasn't from Milestone SRL. So I figured, okay, it's optimized for the Xbox One X. I loved Colin McRae Rally. I enjoy the Dirt Rally games and the the regular Dirt series, but they are not official WRC games, so you can't get the courses like the real Monaco. the real Finland, Sweden courses. So I was all over this. Maybe the series turned over another leaf. No, that's not the case. So this is developed by Big Ben and KT Studios, and it just seems like they inherited uh, this flawed, intellectual property that is the game engine, and just continued making games like Milestone SRL. So I don't know if they're a subsidiary of Milestone, but the games suck, basically. This one, it looks great, but it just handles terribly. It runs at 30 FPS and just choppy and jittery. And then I bought it on a Steam sale for like $6, and I figured, well, at least on the computer, it is all of those things. It does suck, but you can tweak and you can play with the INI files, and you can download process injectors. And I know with WRC4, I got it to a solid 60 frames per second. So I figured I'd do that with WRC7. Nope. Cranked it up on an RTX card to the top settings. It was horrible. Drilled it back and figured, well, let me just try to get a good frame rate. No. Looked for tweaks online. Nothing worked. It is a terrible game. And I'm a fan of racing games, and I'm a fan of European motorsports. And this company, Milestone, and now Big Ben, is just sitting on these licenses and, extracting as much rent, essentially, as they can, extracting as much money as they can, and putting in no effort and putting out really substandard games. So I was angry at myself for falling for it. I was angry at myself for spending money on this game. Okay, I can feel the hate coming. Why in the world is Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Switch on this list? Isn't this an amazing game? Well, I love this game. This is one of the games that defined my childhood. It is arguably one of my favorite gaming memories. Playing this game on the Game Boy with the little Game Boy Light under the covers in a really stormy, snowy February in, I believe, 1994, maybe 1993, whenever it came out. It's just something that I've taken with me my whole life, and it's just such a fond and wonderful memory. So I figured there was no way that I would dislike this game. And in fact, this is the reason why I finally purchased a Switch, even though I was very critical of the Switch. And this is a great game. It's a very solid recreation of that original game. It looks beautiful. There's, very little to dislike here except for one major thing, and that is the horrible frame rate, the slowdown. As you move around the world, particularly when you switch screens, which the way this game is designed, you're doing that quite frequently. The game just slows to a chug sometimes. And, it doesn't ruin the game. You can play through the game. I played through a good bit of it. But it's always there. And since you're switching screens so frequently, it's always annoying you. And, the art style is beautiful. And just the design and the environment of the island was beautiful to begin with. And then you put this beautiful graphical layer. It's so lush, and it, brings it up to a modern standard. And you just want to, inhabit this world. And yet, every move you make, you are frustrated by this slowdown. And again, if you haven't played this game and you're a Switch fan and you pick it up, you will like it. You will probably love it, and you can, this is something you can get past. But as somebody who's, played through this game on the Game Boy, played through it, the DX version, and who loves it, to be constantly frustrated as I move through this world, it was just a letdown. And I ultimately didn't finish it in this form. I was just like, I'm tired of looking at this. I'm tired of seeing this, this disturbing, visual fleck on an otherwise pristine canvas of a world. And I think that's one of the greatest disappointments of all, when you can't have that nostalgia, when there's just this little, this little thing that's kind of poking at you every step of the way through a game. So, so I would have to say this game is a major disappointment, as much as I wanted to love it. And lastly, my biggest disappointment of all, Showdown's Legends of Wrestling. When this game was announced, I believe it was 2004, maybe 2005, I was all in from day one. This game, to me, was going to be the ultimate piece of wrestling nostalgia from my youth. It had all the wrestlers that I loved growing up. It had a visual style that reminded me of the old Hasbro WWF wrestling figures from the late 80s and early 90s. It had Tony Schiavone, Larry Zbyszko, and Bobby the Brain Heenan on commentary. It had a huge roster of these wrestlers from from all the different territories, plus the WWF. It had, classic arenas like the Tokyo Dome and the Arena Mexico and the Cow Palace and all these places where legendary matches have happened. And of course, it had all of your different style matches. I mean, this was going to be the wrestling game that I was going to play for a decade. And what happened? Well, it came out, and it was one of the poorest playing video games that I had ever played. It was just not fun. For as gorgeous as these characters looked, and as much as they resembled the toys that I used to play with day in and day out, it was clunky. It was unresponsive. You'd come off the top rope and you'd kind of just like warp to your opponent. It had terrible hit detection. It was just slow and plodding, and the matches had almost zero excitement to them. And it killed me. It killed me. I wanted to like this. I forced myself to play it. I thought, well, maybe I'm missing something. Let me go through the career mode. Let me try to explore what this game had to offer. Let me try different match types. Okay, maybe the singles matches weren't good. Maybe the tag matches would be better. Well, there's a mistake, because that just multiplies all of the horrible things that this game does. Hardcore matches, everything is bad. And it was a game that just sort of pained me to put back on the shelf and never visit again, at least for that initial 4 or 5 years after release. But since then, you have a little distance, and you're like, well, let me go back. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I remember. Maybe I was just overhyped. Nope, it is still bad. In fact, I played this maybe about 6 months ago. A friend of mine came over, and we were just going through all my PS2 sports games. And we got to this, and we were like, again, hey, this can't be... I know it was bad. I know it was bad in its day, but it can't be that bad. Like, let's try it out. And it was even worse than we remembered it. I mean, it was like, it wasn't even bad in a good way. Like, you couldn't laugh at it. You were just constantly frustrated. And it's such a shame, because this game was wrestling nostalgia before WWE, controlled wrestling nostalgia. It was before WWE 24/7. It was before the network. All of the guys in this game, could be licensed outside of WWE. Plus, you had the classic announcing. That wasn't great announcing, but just hearing those guys together, Schiavone, Larry Zbyszko, and Bobby the Brain Heenan, who was still funny, but you almost, you heard the twinge of cancer in his throat as he was delivering his lines. It was special to have those guys. It was special to have this roster and these locations, and it didn't come together, and it was just literally painful to play, painful to sit through. So this goes down as my most disappointing video game of all time, a game that I wanted to love, and I still want to love it, but can't. So the question to you guys is, what games did you want to like? What games were you hyped for? What games did you try to love, but were just so bad that you couldn't?